I am now the CEO and founder of a company called Unitive, which is in the very exciting HR space. But before that, I did have a security background. I was one of the founders of Silvertail Systems, in case any of you have heard of that. I also was director of fraud prevention at eBay a decade ago. Can you imagine that? And then was with the NSA. So I've spent a lot of time working in security, in fact, most of my professional career. And only lately did I take this kind of hard left turn into HR. And essentially, the reason for that was in being in security, and then especially in a startup, it was very clear that we weren't getting the benefit of our entire society. You know, when I got my PhD in computer science, I think 12% of graduates were women. Right now in security, I think it's somewhere between 11 and 15% are women. If you look around the room here, there's some minorities, but not very many, and yet that's a problem. And so when Silvertail was acquired, I had this moment of, I can do anything. And this was 2013. I don't know, how many of you have heard of Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In? Some of you. Believe it or not, Black Lives Matter was coined as a Twitter hashtag in early 2013. It's a long time ago now. And I decided I wanted to use technology to address some new problem, and that happened to be diversity. And so I ended up in the HR space. So I'm going to talk a bit about HR today, but also about security and how when we don't have enough diversity, we really can cause problems for ourselves as far as being able to address some of the more challenging security issues. You all are facing things way beyond what I ever did. I mean, it's only been 3 years, but my head explodes thinking about what you all are addressing. So, ooh, that's not good. So I just really, let me put it down here, that may help. So I just really admire what you're doing, but I want to make sure that what is happening can be, we can do the very best that we can. So one thing, a lot of the sessions I've been to, people have questions at the end. I'd actually prefer this to be really interactive. So if you have questions, just raise your hand and I'll signal our fantastic mic bearer to come get the mic to you, because the agenda should actually be what you want it to be. So what is groupthink? I think most of you know what it is, but basically, it's when people are in a room and you end up with a conformity of opinions. Usually, the example I give is when a bunch of candidates have been interviewed and somebody, and the interview committee gets back together to discuss all the candidates. A lot of times, either the most senior or the most vocal person in the room kind of slams their fist on the table and says, I really loved Fred, and we need to hire Fred. And you'll see people start to kind of nod their head around the room, and then it's Fred who gets hired, even if other people liked someone else. And this is a psychological phenomenon. It's been known for, tens of years. And yet it can cause a lot of problems because it really diminishes the types of solutions that people can come to. So how does this manifest itself? Mostly it's just through spending time with people who are just like you, which we all do, and that's okay. We live in our communities, and a lot of times we're attracted to communities of people that are like us. Sometimes it's not letting all voices be heard. It's there's something known as mansplaining. Anyone who's heard of mansplaining? So anyone who wants to know what that is, you can follow up with me afterwards, or you could just go watch some of the presidential debates and see some of that. I think it'll be very clear. Disregarding opinions that are different. A lot of times when someone has an opinion that's different from ours, we are so busy that we're trying hard to get to the answer as quickly as possible. And when someone has an opinion different from ours, sometimes we can jump to, oh, that has no credibility. Even though it may have some credibility. It might not be exactly your opinion, it may be somewhat different from yours, but the fact that someone has that opinion actually means there may be something there that you're not thinking about. It's a lot of staying in your comfort zone. So one of the big phrases, and I think even the last speaker was talking about people who have a growth mindset. How many people know what growth mindset means? A few. So growth mindset is actually that when someone says they have a growth mindset, they want to challenge themselves. They want to do new things. One of the recommendations, believe it or not, is once a month, go to a restaurant you've never been to before. A lot of us get into our patterns and our habits, and we don't want to step outside of our comfort zone, and that means we're not experiencing new things. Another thing is take a new way home. And so if you use Waze and you get some of the funky routes that I get, you will end up taking a new way home. But it's good because I've found neighborhoods that I've probably driven within 2 miles of and never actually been there. And so that's another thing that you can do. And the biggest thing about this is, with groupthink, the reason we do this, and psychologically, is that, again, we all have to make, it's estimated we all make 40,000 decisions a day. Everything from, do I want to snooze my alarm again, to, what am I going to wear, to what am I going to have for breakfast, to, do I make my phone call now on my way to walking to this talk, or am I going to make it later? 40,000 decisions we make a day. And so our brains are programmed to try and find the fastest decision possible. And that's a good thing in almost all cases. But it's not a good thing when it comes to certain decisions. So why is groupthink a vulnerability? So security threats, as you all know, vary in motivation. You've got people who want to steal money, but you've got people who want to influence elections. You've got people who are trying to bully or terrorize other people. You've got people who are trying to impact the stock market. You all know way more about what the motivations of these are than I do. But the perpetrators can be from all over the globe, and there's really interesting cultural impacts to how a perpetrator might act. So the example I always give is that when I was at eBay and we opened the eBay China site, in China it's more culturally accepted to copy other people's things, to essentially infringe on their copyrights or even their IP. And so on the eBay China site, it was not considered bad to post a counterfeit set of Nike shoes, because in China, that's okay culturally. And so we have to kind of understand all of the various dimensions of the perpetrator. Now, victims can be anything from banks to individual people. The channel is getting really interesting. The latest attack, you all, again, know way more about it than I do, but, the Internet of Things, we've now got our toasters attacking us, right? So that's a whole new way of thinking about where these attacks are going to come from. And so the key is that it takes a variety of perspectives to address the variety of challenges that we face. And only by having a diverse set of mindsets are we going to get the absolute most innovative solution. A question I often get at this point is, what do you mean by diverse set of mindsets? Are you talking gender? Are you talking race? Are you talking, sexual orientation, sexual preference? And the interesting thing is it goes way beyond that. The way I like to think of it is, we have all learned how to solve problems throughout our whole life. And I would posit that my background, I grew up very much upper middle class America. I went to college. I didn't have to put myself through school. I have been taught to solve problems in a way that's very different from someone who came from a family that only had one parent, who had to work throughout their whole life to help support the family, who maybe put themselves through college, or maybe even didn't go to college, maybe went to a 2-year school or something. All of those parts of our lives teach us to solve problems in very different ways. And so it's by realizing this and realizing that when it comes time to solve a problem, people who have very much the same background that you do are going to walk down the same path to solve that problem. Whereas someone who has a different background, in whatever way that background is different, whether it's cultural, maybe they grew up in a different country, or just they had a different kind of education than you did, the way their brains have been trained to solve a problem will be different from the way you've been trained to solve the same problem. So I don't know, how many of you were in this room for the last session? Anybody? 1, 2, couple. So one of the quotes in the last session was something like, culture eats business strategy for breakfast. It was something like that. And I do think that that's the case, that the culture of a company is really important. But the mistake that often gets made is that people translate culture and culture fit to, do I like to hang out with this person? Which essentially means, are they like me? And that is where we go wrong when we build our teams. So another question for you all. How many of you feel like your company has a culture that you can kind of define? How many of you feel it's really squishy? Yeah, it's hard to define culture. It's really hard. And I'll say that when I started Silvertail, to be honest, I didn't know what it meant to define a culture. And my co-founder and I were very clear. About a year in, it became more clear to us. For us, it was all about transparency. It was about people feeling like they were part of a family. It was about very much collaboration and teamwork and not one-upping each other. But I didn't know it until I kind of had built it and lived it. Culture fit, how many of you would say that when someone is being evaluated for a job at your company, a big part of it is, are they going to get along with the team? How many of you have companies that actually look for people with dissenting opinions? I'm not saying that they're going to be a jerk. That's not what I mean. But who look for people that are complementary? A few. How many wish that your teams looked for people that were complementary? A few more. So it seems like, yeah, is there a question? Let's wait for the microphone. I'm being very good about behaving. And it gives me a chance to have a drink.
You spoke about wanting your company culture to make people feel like they were part of a family. I always find this is a bit of a red flag for me because families can often be very dysfunctional. So how do you avoid bringing that aspect of family culture into the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for us, as far as being part of a family, it was much more that we cared about the person as a whole, like their entire life. So we had several cases where we would have someone who would have to work over a weekend. And in those cases, we sent the spouse something that we knew the spouse liked. In the case of a wife, we sent them a spa getaway with the husband for later. In the case of a husband, we sent them tickets to go to a baseball game with their family. So we wanted it just to be really clear that we saw their whole being. We also did things like, I had a child while I was, what was I, chief visionary or something. And we made that part of it. Like we brought the child in a lot and we encouraged people to bring the children in. We had people who wanted to go work in their kids' preschools and we encouraged that, just mark it on your calendar. I don't care if you have to miss 2 hours, one on a Tuesday and one on a Thursday. So it was much more about embracing that. Every company and culture is going to have dysfunction, right? Everyone is. I wish that I could say it's not. So we definitely certainly didn't try and fight over Thanksgiving dinner type things. But it's a good point, and you have to sort of grasp that culture and realize those negative things when they occur. This is fantastic. I love when people ask questions, so please keep doing that, because again, you have things that are of interest to you, and I mostly just want to make this as interesting to you all as possible. Okay. So a big part of this is, as the research shows, so all of what I'm going to talk about today is based on 40 years of research, which to me doesn't seem like very much, but psychologists have really started thinking about these things in the last 40 years. And it's all about, if you get too many people who are similar on a team, you get a lot less conflict, but also a lot less innovation. And so one of the key things, too, is to be sure that you can have respectful conflict. And for me, that meant never hiring an ego. And we did hire egos, but you have to be ready to get rid of them quickly. A little bit tough in the security field, no offense to anybody. There's a lot of egos. But making sure that whatever your culture is, that you can embrace that. And I recommend, beyond anything, hiring people who are going to conflict and embracing that. It's really hard for people who are conflict averse. I am, but at the same time, if you can get a few people who are very big on getting to the very best solution, you can actually position the conflict that way. And that's what I've seen really healthy teams do, is say, okay, Fred, I actually really disagree with what you're saying, but I'm only doing this because I want to get to the best solution. And my thought is a slightly better solution than what you have is this. And you can do it really respectfully, which is key. Any other questions before we move on? Yeah. 2 more. Let's do 2, and then we'll keep going.
Yes, about conflict. When is too much conflict unproductive?
Yeah, so the biggest risk with a team and conflict is never actually getting to the solution. And so you definitely have to have a leadership team who is going to put their foot down and say, we just have to build something. And I think, as you all know, especially in the security space, sometimes you have to go with that 80% solution, because you're never, if you have to get to perfection, what is the thing? Perfect is the enemy of good enough, right? And so if you're never going to get to perfection, and you could just discuss forever. But you need a leadership team who's going to be able to put their foot down and say, here is where we're going to start building now that we've had all of this discussion. Now, they're going to get it wrong sometimes too, by the way. But hopefully the thing is you can learn from that and grow. There was another one back in the corner.
Yes, I don't want to steal your thunder, but are you going to be talking about red teaming, concept of red teaming? And
So I'm not specifically going to be talking about red team, the security type of it. I'm more going to talk about how to build teams and that are diverse. Awesome. So what are the best ways to combat groupthink? And it's to surround yourself with people who are different from you. And again, when I say different, a lot of times people go right to gender and race and sort of the typical things. But think about things like socioeconomic background. Think about things like, okay, if 80% of my team came out of Ivy League schools, maybe I need a few that didn't. By the way, where you went to school is highly, highly predictive of your parents' socioeconomic background and nothing else. This is all in Laszlo Bock's book, where he studied all the Google people who work at Google. Turns out, where you went to school is not predictive of how well you're going to perform in a job. Zero predictability. It does predict if your parents are rich. So for me, the best place to start surrounding yourself with people who are different from you is in hiring, because that's where you're selecting new people for your teams. And what often happens in hiring is that we like to hire people we feel very comfortable with, people who are like us. And so this is what's known as unconscious bias. And I'm going to go into a definition around unconscious bias. But it's, instead of thinking about if someone can do the job, it's thinking about whether or not I like to hang out with them. And let's be very clear. We spend more time with our people at work than we do with our families. Going back to the dysfunction question before, if there's that dysfunction, that's going to be a big problem. But if you want to think about what's best for your organization, and for me on the security side, if you want to think about what's best for whoever you're protecting, whether it's your own company or your customer's company, it is all about making sure you have the best, most complementary minds in the room. So all the research shows that if you bring together a whole bunch of people who are A players and think really clearly, but have very similar backgrounds, but you bring together sort of the B players who maybe aren't at the top of their field, but they're complementary, the B players will outdo the A players all the time because they all think differently. That's the key. By thinking differently, you get to a new way of looking at things. So unconscious bias is it's unconsciously thinking about things that are not relevant to the actual hiring decision. And it goes way beyond, like I said, just race and gender. I talked to a company, this was actually, it was in the hardware space, it was a technology company, not a security company. But they were being sued because someone sent an email that said, don't hire that person, they're not a Red Sox fan. This is even where unconscious bias can come into play. Peter Thiel now takes back this statement or this strategy, but when PayPal was first being formed, they only hired people who played basketball. I don't know if you've heard a lot of sales teams say, we only hire people who play hockey. Now the thing is, they're looking for a certain type of people. The people who play hockey are aggressive. They know how to work out as a team. All of those are great traits. But the people who are aggressive and know how to work as a team is a much bigger set than the people who play hockey. And so you can just get yourself into trouble. And again, the people who play hockey very likely had a very similar background. So it's just, when you are thinking about things that are not relevant for the job, then you are going to end up thinking about things that make you comfortable. And I posit that being comfortable is not more important than getting the very best team. Who wants to disagree with me on that one? Please. It's hard, right? Yeah.
I don't want to disagree. I want to ask a question.
Yeah, please.
Hi. First of all, just a testimonial. I worked with her, so the family question before. I was at Silvertail, and it was a fantastic experience. Thank you. Yeah. My question is, in the context of the startup, where you do, how do we balance this, I want someone to be different from me, with the fact that I do spend 20 hours a day thinking about it, so it bleeds into it. So how, especially in the startup environment, how can we navigate that?
Yeah. So let me ask this question. How many of you are in companies that have 50 or fewer employees? 500 and fewer. Okay. 2,000 and fewer. Okay. And then anybody over 2,000? Oh, like half the room. Okay. So this is an interesting question, and I've struggled a lot with this, especially in startups, because a lot of times what happens in startups is you're moving so fast that you have to hire your friends. I mean, they're the people you know, they're in your circle and all of that. Let me start by talking about half of the room, which is in the bigger companies, and then I'll come back to that. But in the bigger companies, easy is the wrong word, but it can be a little easier, because in the bigger companies, you can think about, where do I want my company to be in 2 years? Where if you've got a company of 30 people, you're actually wondering if you're going to pay the paycheck next week. I mean, it may not be that severe, but it's literally, you're not even sure you're going to be around in 2 years. So you're kind of not planning for that long-term future. But for those of you who are in companies that are where you know you're going to be around in 2 years, it's all about getting super diverse teams, because that's how you're going to beat your competitors, by the way, because that's how you're going to get really great results and really innovative solutions. Now, in a startup, the fact that it's 20 or 30 people and you're really going to be in each other's face all day, it really is about making sure that there's that respectful conflict. And so it really is about hiring people around your values. And I'll get to that in a minute, but if innovation is something that's important to you, one thing I believe about the security space today, 3 years ago when I was at Silvertail, I said it was super muddy because there's just so many companies out there. I think it's muddier today than it was. There's a lot of new companies. They all say they're doing the same thing. The very best way to beat your competitor is to out-innovate them or out-market them. But let's put that aside, because I don't think that that's very authentic. But the very best way is to actually out-innovate them and to be able to show that your solution is better than theirs. And the very best way to do that is to come with a diversity of perspectives to solve a problem. So again, it does get back to culture and being sure that it's respectful and that people can conflict and still really appreciate each other at the end of the day. And a lot of that is, again, a leadership team who's saying, and it doesn't even have to be the leadership team. All of you can do this too. When there's a conflict and maybe, Mary's opinion got chosen and Fred's didn't, about somebody saying, hey, Fred, I'm really glad you brought that up. It actually helped us see how Mary's solution is really good. So it's about valuing everyone no matter what. And you have to be really mindful of that, and that's hard. And I hate that I'm saying this because I wish I could give you some kind of programmatic thing of like, if you just flip this switch, you're done. And I can talk a little bit about some of those things, but it is about being mindful about that. So on this slide, I brought up the thing of unconscious bias. How many of you have had unconscious bias training at your companies? Not very many. So I predict in the next 18 months, half this room will raise their hands about this. This is the big deal that's going on now. The unfortunate thing is, the research shows unconscious bias trainings in general don't work. There are trainings that do work. It has to be 6 months long. It has to be 5 hours per week per person. And then you will see a behavior change. For those of you who had unconscious bias training, raise your hand again. Keep your hand up if it was 6 months long and at least 5 hours a week per person. Yeah, I mean, nobody can commit to that, right? And so I don't want to disrespect unconscious bias training at all. It's good, it raises awareness. It creates a vocabulary so you can talk to people about these things. But it doesn't actually change the behavior. And so I'm going to focus specifically on the hiring process. But the way that you change unconscious bias in the hiring process is by actually changing the process itself. So the first thing you need to do is define the job. And this gets back to people often see a resume or they see someone in an interview and they say, wow, they went to the same school I did, or they played water polo too. Or I just talked to them and they were at the same bar I was at last night. Not relevant. 0% relevance to the job. And so by defining the job ahead of time and what skills and values are important for that job, that's how you get past being distracted by these other things. So you need to define the skills and values that are appropriate for that job. And by the way, if anyone's interested on how to implement this, I can help you with that. With this, what I'm going to talk about now is based on 9 different research studies, but these things can be implemented in software, so you don't have to worry if anyone's been trained. Reviewing resumes, it really comes down to 2 things: blind resume review. there's been, I think, 4 or 5 studies recently on this, but the example from last December, a gentleman named Jose sent out resumes to 100 companies, got 0 callbacks. He removed the S and became Joe and got 37 callbacks. Same resume. And this happens on race, it happens on gender. Unfortunately, this is just where we live, and it's unconscious. I would claim that 99% of people have really good intentions, but their brain says maybe this person isn't as qualified as someone else. Another thing you can do on resumes is be very quantified in what you're doing. You could create an Excel spreadsheet that has different rows for things like skills and experience and whatever education, whatever you're looking at on a resume, and you score each one on those. So you have a column for each resume, and then you just do the math and compute a score. And that will help you do that as well. And if anyone's interested, I can talk about other ways to do that. And then on interviewing, the key is actually structured interviews. So what I mean by that is if 5 candidates are going to be interviewed and you have 4 people on the interview committee, by the way, the research shows 4 is the optimal number. Any more than that, you actually do not gain any more accurate results on the interview. So if you have 4 people on the interview committee, you assign each interviewer a skill or a value to evaluate each candidate on. A lot of times you actually have them write down what the question is they're going to ask, because if I'm interviewing 5 candidates and I ask each of them, tell me how you are a continuous learner, if maybe continuous learning is one of your company's values. If I ask each one the same question, we actually get apples to apples comparison. Whereas what happens in interviewing a lot is people walk in the room and they either decide they like or do not like the person in 10 seconds. And based on whether they like them or do not like them, they ask them very different questions. They either throw softball questions or very hard questions. And by creating what's called structured interviews, where each person is assigned a set of questions to ask each candidate, and then scoring each of those, you get quantifiable results. There's other things around this too, like publishing the feedback. People just behave better if they know their people are going to read their feedback. So things like that can happen. And again, this is like where I've spent the last 3 years of my life, so I can go into lots of detail on this. But a big part of it is focus on the skills, but especially on the values. I think we all can recognize good skills in security pretty quickly, but values is often where people try to go to culture fit and they don't know how to evaluate for culture fit. How many of your companies have a set of values? How many don't? Okay, so it looks like everybody has a set of values, which is awesome, because a lot of times when I talk to people on interviewing, they say, I can interview on whether or not they can do a SQL injection, blah, blah, blah. I'm now dating myself. That was probably like a decade ago. But I don't know how to evaluate for culture fit, so I end up just talking to them of, hey, what do you like? What are you passionate about? And it turns out, their kid also plays lacrosse, and my kid plays lacrosse, and therefore they're a culture fit. That isn't actually what culture fit is meant to mean. It's meant to mean that they are aligned with your values. And this actually goes to a couple of questions. It goes to the dysfunction question, and it goes to the question of, are you going to get along with them? Because, first of all, you have to be sure your values actually match your culture. I was at eBay, and they released some set of values, and I looked at it and went, huh? I don't think so. So it's important to make sure that the values match your company culture. It also is important to make sure they're inclusive. So I saw a set of values actually for the San Francisco Parks Association, and they were awesome. They were things like respect and resilience and such, and that's really good. I've seen other sets of values that were things like we are hard drivers and we are competitive. It turns out those things can tend to turn away certain people. So it's really important to make sure your values are inclusive. the next thing you can do is highlight the values that are important for your company in the job descriptions themselves. And this usually should go into the company description, but it's really great if you're writing your team description or the role description to really highlight these things, because that's how you're going to attract people that match these values. Because we all know we don't want to interview people who are not good fit, and so making sure we get to the people who are going to match these is important. And then in the interview on the culture fit side, interview just for these values and set up an interview system where people do not get scored on what school they went to. Again, not predictive. They don't get scored on if they drink the same alcohol you do. They don't get scored on their ping pong capabilities, unless you are a ping pong company. But even I've talked to a specific retail company in the sports apparel space. And it's funny, I made the joke when I was talking to them. I said, gosh, wouldn't it be horrible if someone in the interview asked, what is your mile time? And there's this nervous laughter and like, yeah, that actually happens a lot. But this company is looking to also appeal to people who do yoga and who like sort of sports leisure wear. And if you want people who know how to address those customers, you have to have people who think like that. And yoga people, how many here do yoga? Anybody? How many know your mile time? You know, there we go. We got one. Way to go. But, you know, those can be very disparate groups. So we have 3 minutes. I want to leave some time for questions. But the key here is that, believe it or not, it's one simple thing. If you can focus on the values of your company when you're thinking about culture fit, you can actually start to attract a much more diverse set of people and get a team that is really going to be innovative and really going to be able to solve challenging problems. This is not the security talk you were thinking it was going to be, but hopefully it was value anyway. Questions? Yeah.
I was just curious, you mentioned the book Lean In at the beginning of the talk. What is your kind of thoughts on that book and whether it's actually a helpful mindset or not?
Great.
Especially for minorities.
Yeah, so I read Lean In and Lean In is what you're asking about? Yeah. I read Lean In and I was completely disheartened. There are two sides of this conversation. One is the minorities need to change. The other side is the organizations need to change. That's kind of the Anne-Marie Slaughter side of this. I don't know if any of you have read her work, but if you want two different perspectives, read Sheryl Sandberg and read Anne-Marie Slaughter, and you'll see the whole spectrum. I think it's somewhere in the middle. I really hate the things that say, hey, women, you need to be more confident and you need to stop doing this, because that's not in our nature. It's like saying to an athlete, you need to stop working out and eating healthy. I mean, that's just not in their nature. So I think we need to find something that values the entire spectrum. Other questions? Awesome. We have 56 seconds left. We can all sit here.
I'll ask.
Yeah. There we go.
So you mentioned like it's good to hire this diversity, but sometimes to get that you have to acknowledge it, right? You have to go, this person, right? Isn't that sort of what you're saying, right? So
you have to acknowledge that person
didn't go to Stanford or
yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah. So that is okay. So let's be very clear. I'm definitely not saying you need to lower the bar. I'm not saying that. Yeah. So that's often where people go wrong, is by saying that. But you do have to say, we already have 90% of people who went to Stanford or MIT or Harvard. We have a whole bunch of people who grew up in upper middle class. We do not have people who maybe had to put themselves through college, or we don't have someone who, on my team, I've got someone who grew up in a cult, right? So it's okay to go embrace those types of backgrounds and look for some grit and some resilience and all of that, because those are going to have different perspectives. I'm worried I'm not answering your question, though. No problem. Do you want to try again?
Sure. I guess, so how do you, I mean, would you interview based on questions that assess talent, or like how do you do
so
this?
assess skills, for sure, assess skills. But then when it comes to culture fit, look for people who, whatever your values are, just look for that and stop there. Don't look for the other things. So it should be about skills, and then it should be about whatever it is your culture is, and that's it. And people try and go beyond that into what school they went to or whatever. And we're trying too hard, and by trying too hard, we end up screwing up the process. Do we have time for one more question? We're kind of over. How about one?
Do one more and then we'll wrap.
Okay. Oh, thank you. That was very fair of you.
Okay, so let's say you're walking into a team to be the candidate for an interview with a team that looks not very diverse.
Yeah.
Group of founders, small company, friends. You're definitely not like them.
Yeah.
Is there anything you can say to them to say, hey, let's be more diverse, without saying it directly? I mean, how do you know?
Yeah, so working in the diversity field for the last 3 or 4 years, diversity is this third rail term, right? And even unconscious biases. So thank you so much for coming to my session. But notice that I don't think either of those were in the explanation. But I think there could be really interesting things about talking to them about, do you think we could solve problems better if we had a diversity of, if we had perspectives that were complementary to what you have? I think there's a really interesting conversation to have there. And actually, if the answer is no, I might run away. But there are ways to definitely bring this up without saying unconscious bias, without saying diversity, of just, I worry that because we all learn to solve problems the same way, that maybe we're missing something. And I would love to just talk to somebody who solved problems in a different way and see what their perspective is. I think there's interesting things about doing that. And I'll make one last comment. Hiring a diverse team is not the end of it. I wish it was. You have to then have an inclusive culture too that values everybody, and that's like talk number 2 or something. But and then you have to help with promotions, and unfortunately it goes on and on. But at least when you're hiring, you're starting to build the team that's going to be super innovative, and then I think that's the first step. And then after that, you figure out how to kind of make it stay that way, make it inclusive and continue to be powerful. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.